Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to today's webinar, How Social Enterprises Are Making Waves with Rosalind Peschel. My name is Alia Gina, and I'm your host for today's event. We are so delighted that you're taking the time to share some of your afternoon with us for this session to learn more about social enterprises. As many of you know, this is Alberta Women in Entrepreneurship Week, where events like this have taken place across Alberta post-secondary institutions over the last 5 days. Women all over the province have shared their entrepreneurial experiences with audience just like you. Today's event is being hosted by the Trico Foundation Social Entrepreneurship Center. What is that, you might ask? Well, about a year ago, Wayne and Eleanor Chu's family foundation, the Trico Charitable Foundation, made a generous gift to the Haskayne School of Business. This gift established the Trico Foundation Social Entrepreneurship Center, where our mandate is to support a thriving community, build social enterprise education, support curriculum development, and fuel teaching excellence. As there is a growing recognition of the possibilities offered by social enterprises, Haskayne students in our community will have the unique opportunity to get in on the ground floor of a growing movement to do well by doing good. Since the gift was announced in the fall of 2019, we have developed some programming to engage our community and give students more exposure to social enterprise. One of the ways we are doing this is through a strong partnership with the Enactus Student Club. One of the programs they run is called Companies in Question, which has been abbreviated to SANC. In this club, small groups of students work alongside social entrepreneurs to get a real sense of how these companies do good and also do well. This opportunity is open to all students, undergraduate or graduate, in any faculty across the University of Calgary campus. Deadline for applications to this program is quickly approaching, so if it's something you're interested in or want to look into more information, I'm including the link in the chat for the application form. There you go. Another way we are exposing students to social enterprise and engaging our community is by having more participation in the MBA's final course. This course is known as a capstone course. And in this course, diverse companies submit projects for MBA students to work on over the semester. This semester, or this year, we managed to increase the number of social enterprise projects by almost 50%. So now we'll get to a little bit more about Zoom. I know that you guys are mostly familiar with Zoom. Next slide, please. Our presenter will have slides to share, so you may be a little more comfortable selecting the speaker view option in the top right-hand corner of your screen. Also, please note that today's session is being recorded. And please take a minute to introduce yourselves in the chat. And we also have a poll, so tell us who you are, what kind of organization you're with, but also make an introduction in the chat. So that's on its way. And then we will be, if there are any questions during the session, please note you'll be muted, but we'll take questions at the end during the question and answer portion. But if you have a burning question, just pop it in the chat and we'll be monitoring that as well. So I'm going to end the polling so we can see. Okay, so now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you today's speaker, Rosalind Peschel. Rosalind is an instructor in the Entrepreneurship and Innovation area at the Haskayne School of Business. She teaches both entrepreneurial thinking, a mandatory class for all Haskayne undergraduate students, and strategies in social enterprise to undergrad and MBA students. She has always had a passion for social enterprise and believes in the power of using business as a force for good. Rosalind is also the faculty advisor for Enactus at UCalgary, a university-wide student club that empowers students to create projects and businesses that solve society's most pressing challenges. When Roz isn't focused on school, you will likely find her spending time with her family and her courses. Roz, with that, the floor is now yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. I am really very excited to be here today. I'm having some slight delays in my slides responding to me, so I apologize if I jump through those a little bit. So wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for that introduction, Alia, and thank you for asking me to be here today. Here are some of the things that I want to talk about today. Alia just gave a great introduction. I just have a very short anecdote that I like to start with. I tell my students it, and I think it's relevant for what we're talking about today too. We're going to talk a little bit through, what is social enterprise. I by no means plan to belabor the definition of social enterprise. I think it's high time that we get to move beyond that. But really some of the things that I think are so interesting and so valuable are talking about, why do we need social enterprise? What are some of the signs of hope and optimism and progression happening? And why now? So Alia did just give you an introduction to myself. This is me and my family about a year ago. This is our darling horse Nemo, one of our wonderful horses. As Alia mentioned, I am an instructor at Haskayne. I've been working here for the last nearly 4 years now, and a job that I really, really enjoy. I will preface this presentation by saying that when I teach about social enterprise, it's one of my favorites, but I recently just finished a block week in social enterprise. So that meant that I was talking for about 8 hours a day, 5 days in a row on social enterprise. So creating a presentation for only an hour and a half, to be perfectly honest, I'm not quite sure where we're going to end up on timing. I hope to be able to fill the time and have some Q&A at the end. But I could literally talk for an entire week on this. So we'll get there in a moment. I think one of the sort of meaningful moments for me in my history and my background in terms of discovering the wonderful world of social enterprise was when I was doing my undergrad. When I started my undergrad, I started in biology, and I imagined that I was going to, have a future in medical school and ultimately become a heart surgeon. And the idea of being a heart surgeon, the impact that I could create in people's lives that way was something that was really motivational for me and something that seemed really important and valuable to do. Like so many others that start in that path, I realized a few years later that that was in fact not the right path for me. I had a number of entrepreneurial business influences in my life, and I thought that there'd be no risk in going to business school. If that wasn't going to be medicine, then business seemed like a good option. But one day early on, when I had transferred into business, I was walking across campus at the U of C. I was making my way to Scurfield Hall, where our business school is housed. And I overheard some students in the social sciences building basically talking about how business is evil. And how if it weren't for business and the fat cat business leaders and their greed, then there wouldn't be so many problems in the world that they would ultimately have to solve. And so going from the semester previously thinking that I was going to be a heart surgeon to now being told that I was basically evil and horrible was a bit of a identity crisis, I suppose, for me. I did very fortunately, happily discover that, that was absolutely not the case. And there as a time that I came to learn very quickly after that, not only is business not evil, but there's also a subset of business that is doing exactly the opposite and is so specifically trying to solve social and environmental problems through the work that they're doing. And so that's, leads me here. Social enterprise ends up being, one of my favorite things. And so, as I mentioned, I can talk about this for quite a while, but I look forward to having a conversation about this with all of you here as well. So starting quickly, with the idea of what is social enterprise, I think many people are very familiar with this now. And again, I don't want to belabor the definition, but, it wasn't so long ago that I would be talking to people about social enterprise, largely, people in Calgary, and people say, oh, that's like a community garden, right? Well, no, not exclusively, maybe, but not exclusively. And so without belaboring definitions, I think it is valuable to start here, because I think it proves a point. I think that on the one hand, having an understanding and having a definition that we can work with to say what is and what isn't is valuable as far as measurement goes, as far as reporting impact goes. It's not about trying to split hairs and decide whether something is or isn't necessarily, but to have a bit of a framework around that. And so, one from the Trico Charitable Foundation here in Calgary, and just so simple and straightforward. Social entrepreneurship is using business models or markets, as in selling products or services, to solve social problems. Ashoka is an international organization that focuses in social entrepreneurship and talking about these being individuals with innovative solutions to society's most pressing social, cultural, and environmental challenges. Ambitious and persistent, tackling major issues and offering new ideas for systems level change. And then another one from Social Enterprise Northern Ireland. This is very specifically saying that it is a business with primarily social objectives whose surpluses are principally reinvested for the purpose of the business or the community, rather than being driven by the need to maximize profit for shareholders and owners alone. And so the reason that I talk about these is that I don't think that there is only one definition. I don't think that there is only one thing, and I don't think that you either necessarily are or aren't. I think this is, these things exist across a spectrum. One more from School Center for Social Entrepreneurship, and I've just highlighted some things here that I think are so relevant. It's about this idea of transforming systems. And by that, it's talking about discovering the root causes of problems. This is not about creating a Band-Aid solution necessarily. The long-term solution needs to be about understanding that root cause, really understanding why problems are happening and what's keeping them in place. Social entrepreneurship can happen across fields, across sectors, can happen, in any different industry. Social entrepreneurs then become drivers of change, creating efficient, sustainable, transparent mechanisms to have measurable impact. And so I really like all these. I don't, ascribe to only one. I think there's so many pieces of these that are so valuable. And I think an image like this is so valuable for that idea that this can be a spectrum. Social enterprises really do kind of exist in this space between charity and business, where the primary social value for a the primary driver for a charity is that social value, where the primary driver for a traditional business is financial value. And social enterprises are really working to try to blend those two together and have those things, working in concert. One of the ideas that I've taken from Dan Overall, the executive director of the Trico Charitable Foundation, we were having a conversation a little while ago about defining social enterprise. He said, I think it's really time that we move past the definition of social enterprise into the potential for social enterprise. And I think that's such a valuable thing, right? Is not just about the definition. And, an example, he talks about thinking about the definition of a violin. For me, I was thinking about, the definition of a piano. If we think about that, it's a large keyboard musical instrument with a wooden case enclosing a soundboard and metal strings, which are struck by hammers when keys are depressed, the string's vibration is stopped, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That doesn't give us any insight into the actual potential of piano, does it? We can, think about, just the music that's here. And I have a very short musical clip that I hope will work of a Liszt piano. He's a piano virtuoso and playing some of the music that he's done. Oh, this worked before. Okay, sorry, I had a short clip of just this most incredible piece of Liszt music and a piano. So unfortunately, you'll have to use your imaginations, but I know that you've all heard a piano, and I know that you can all attest to the fact that what a piano does and the potential of it is so much greater than the definition for it. And so thinking about the ways in which we can have social enterprise move from those definitions that are valuable and have some really good information and help us to make sure that we have a common understanding about what social enterprise is or what it's trying to do, but moving to the potential for it and really trying to focus on, you know, what we can accomplish and how we can accomplish and why we can accomplish with those things. So sorry that didn't work. That was going to be cool. But anyways, when we think about, you know, moving to the potential for social entrepreneurship, I think another important question is, you know, well, why do we even need social enterprise? You know, and I think that, you know, there are people that fall on both sides of this. You know, there are people who just understand innately, and there are other people who genuinely, you know, question why would we need a business to do this? You know, if you ascribe to any type of Milton Friedman type economics, in that, you know, the only purpose of business is business. The only social need for a business is to increase its profits, because then it can pay more taxes and the government can take care of the social issues. Then a business trying to solve social problems seems like it's a business that's not staying in its lane. I think, though, you know, there are great signs of progress and things that have been happening in our world since, you know, since the First World War, is that we see some incredible advancements in terms of, you know, the life expectancy globally has more than doubled in the last, not since the World War, but in the last, you know, since the Industrial Revolution, our life expectancy has doubled. The child mortality in Canada has gone down 98% since the mid-1800s. The GDP per capita has gone up nearly 3,000%, 2,680% since the early 90s in Canada. And global poverty rates have steadily declined in the last 30 years. We are down 36% in terms of global poverty rates than we were in 1990. So these are all wonderful examples of things that are going well and that social problems are being solved. But it's not all good news, right? We do have some things that are going well. Despite the fact that poverty rates are going down, we still have some shocking rates of poverty here in Canada, especially when we look at Indigenous children in terms of, you know, double-digit 50% of Indigenous children living in poverty. We have drinking water advisories, you know, hundreds of them, thousands of them in Canada alone. And so where we are one of the countries with the most wonderful natural resource and reservoir of fresh water, we're still having these drinking water advisories where it ranges from a boil water to a do not consume advisory. We have food insecurity. We have people who don't have reliable, easy access to food that's close to them. You know, this is considerably worse in our northern territories, but to think that these are double-digit numbers across all of the provinces in Canada is kind of surprising as well. Other social issues include things like, you know, female representation. This is, you know, the number of females on boards. And, you know, there has been a little bit of movement. It's funny, when I look for these numbers, I'm sure that I know that there is more up-to-date information than this, but specifically looking at Canadian numbers, for some reason 2016 is one of the most recent numbers. But we still have 45% of companies that don't have a single female on their board. And, you know, again, for some people, they might think that, well, you know, what's the big deal? Maybe women don't want to be on the boards. Maybe there aren't women who are qualified to be on the boards. So that number makes sense. But neither one of those things are true. Women do want to be on boards. Women are qualified to be on boards. And it's proven that companies are more financially successful when women are on boards. The Rana Plaza collapse, you know, this is a single event in which 1,100 people died working in a garment factory in order to create inexpensive t-shirts. We have, you know, other water crises around the world. We have pretty shocking plastic pollution. That, you know, we have, I can't remember the exact numbers right now, but there is something like 8 tons of plastic that goes into the water every year. and that number is going up all the time. You know, there are 2 billion people in the world that lack access to basic sanitation. At least 10% of the world is thought to consume food that has been irrigated with wastewater. I'm maybe belaboring this point a little bit, but you know, there's some income inequality that we see. There's some remarkable poverty that still exists in the world. And despite the fact that, you know, poverty is going down, we do still have people. There were 736 million people living on less than $2 a day in 2015. Still quite a lot. And we have these massive social movements of our time in terms of Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement. And so for me, ultimately, this is showing that we have social problems that are more significant than our governments and charities alone can solve. Citizens are expecting higher levels of service and attention to social matters than governments are able to accommodate at this time. Capitalism and corporations do have tremendous power. The for-profit motive is very motivational. And business is one of the single largest institutions on the planet. So for me, it only makes sense that business can and should be playing a role in solving these. And so, you know, some signs of hope. You know, I think that I've belabored the point in terms of there being some social issues. And for me, 2020 has been a tough enough year as it is. So where can we look to for some optimism and some hope? Well, let's start with one of the most capitalistic of capitalists. This is Larry Fink. He is the CEO and chairman of BlackRock Capital Investment Corporation. BlackRock Capital has more than $6 trillion of assets under management. It makes this corporation the single largest investor on the planet. About 2 years ago now, a year and a half ago now, Larry Fink made a statement that to prosper over time, every company must not only deliver financial performance, but also show how it makes a positive contribution to society. In order to receive funding from BlackRock Capital, companies must now demonstrate that they have a purpose beyond just making money in order for BlackRock to invest. So I'm not naive to think that this is just out of the goodness of his heart, but this is a statement from a capitalist recognizing that one, business has to, and two, there's probably money to be made by focusing on more than just making money. The Business Roundtable is an association of chief executive officers for America's leading companies. So a membership that is available only to CEOs. Pardon me. These CEO members are leading companies that have more than 15 million employees in the US and have more than $7 trillion in annual revenues. And so just just more than a year ago, they put out a new statement on the purpose of a corporation. Having previously ascribed to the Friedman idea that it is simply about shareholders, they decided and had 181 signatories to this statement that said, Business Roundtable today announced the release of a new statement of a purpose of a corporation, signed by 181 CEOs who commit to lead their companies for the benefit of all stakeholders, customers, employees, suppliers, communities, and shareholders. So I think this is a fairly landmark kind of thing, right? This is saying that, no, we're actually not here just to make profit, just for the people who own shares of our company. But anyone who is affected by or can affect our company should be considered. For many, both of these previous examples are ones where, you know, is kind of following the lead of the certified B Corporation and the B Corp movement. So the very first B Corp was certified in 2007. And this is a group of people who are using business as a force for good. So essentially people who have committed to a higher level purpose for their company. To become a certified B Corporation, an organization needs to go through a fairly rigorous, very rigorous impact assessment. It's a 200 question questionnaire that asks questions about their customers, their environment, their suppliers, their governance, and they have to achieve a score of 80 points or higher in order to qualify to become a certified B Corporation. These are people who have stated very publicly and committed to the fact that they are going to use their business as a force for good. There is not just becoming certified, but there's also a step that these organizations have to take to go and actually adopt some language into their articles of incorporation that says we are not just about our shareholders. We will consider the environment. We will consider our community. We will consider our workers and our governance. And what's really interesting about this change to the Articles of Incorporation is particularly in the States, where previously, if you are a corporation, you are allowed to make the decision, you are actually expected to make the decision that will make your company the most money. When you become a benefit corporation or a certified B Corp, you are expected to make the decision that is the best for your company and for the environment and for all of those stakeholders, not just the shareholders. And what this means is that to become a certified B Corp or a benefit corporation, stakeholders, shareholders can sue the directors of that company if they make a decision that they feel is out of touch with the environment or the social community in which they're working, which is a fairly massive thing, I would say. There are some very notable B Corps. As of today, there are more than 3,500 B Corps in 70 countries around the world, seeing some fairly significant growth. I talk about B Corps in my class every year, and it's really fun because every time I do, I update the number. And the first time I talked about them, I think there's about 1,300, and then there was 17, then there was 22 and 28, now 35. So it's pretty neat. Companies like Hootsuite, like New Belgium Brewing Company. I just happen to have a kombucha. Oh, it's not going to show up with my screen, but I have a kombucha that I got from Costco that's a certified B Corp, which is kind of cool as well. One of the biggest and one of the sort of interesting examples of the power of B Corp in this movement is Danone. And so Danone is a multinational, and they have, I don't know how many, but a lot of subsidiaries. And Danone Global has become the first multinational corporation to publicly commit to pursuing the certified B Corporation. They are doing this both by certifying many of their subsidiaries. And so Danone North America is a certified B Corp, and it is the world's largest B Corp, certified B Corp, which is kind of neat. The other thing that I think is quite cool about this organization, and one of the things that they are doing using their B Corp for this, is that they are using their B Corp certification and their impact report. That's the wonderful thing about the B Corp certification, is that when you go through it, you get an impact report, and it shows you and it tells the world exactly how you're doing across these different categories. And so Danone has actually worked with some of their creditors to use their impact as a way of reducing the cost of their capital. And so what they have done is they had some staggering loan that they took out about 2 years ago, and they have worked with their banks and their creditors to say that if the more sales that they make through their B Corp subsidiaries, the lower their interest rate on the loan will be. There's two different environmental, social, and governance factors that they're looking at, or ESG factors. And so the more improvement that they can show over those factors over the course of the loan, the lower their interest rate will be at the end of that loan. And the B Corp sales through B Corps is going to be one of the ways that they're measuring that. So I think that's quite an interesting one as well in terms of the impact or the potential impact for this. Another interesting example, I think, is the You know, the wealth transfer. I hear about this in so many different contexts. And just recently I was hearing about this in the, you know, the reason and the signs of movement in terms of the adoption of social enterprise. And so the world's largest, or the largest wealth transfer in the history of the world is about to occur. And it's estimated that about $63 trillion is going to be transferred either to widows or inherited by the next generation. And what's kind of interesting about this is that something like 85% of widows and 93% of those inheriting children expect that they will be firing their financial advisor within 3 years of inheriting that money. And the reason they expect to fire that person is because they don't expect that the current person is going to be willing to change the investment strategy to reflect societal changes. Think that those people are going to be too stuck in the old ways in terms of investment, and they're going to be looking for someone new and someone different in order to be reflecting all of these things that are happening in our world and going on right now. So, you know, I think the question then is, you know, why now? Why are these things happening? There's lots of momentum. There's lots of things that are building and moving in this direction. And so why is this all happening, or why is this most important? Why do we see that social enterprise are making waves, particularly right at this instant? And for me, I think that, you know, there's a lot of things that we've talked about already. But I think that the COVID-19 pandemic is a big driver for this. You know, we hear this idea of the new normal fairly regularly these days. And I think one of the things that has become so obvious for me is that this pandemic is exposing so many of the systematic inequalities of our global economic system. Right? We have essential workers that don't have savings, they don't have healthcare, they don't have support, but they have to go to work. You know, they have to figure out how to take care of kids when kids are, you know, daycares are shut down. And what's interesting is that this 6 or 8 months or however long it's been now of the pandemic is actually really already demonstrating a significant threat towards the attainment of so many of our sustainable development goals. And so the UN has estimated that the economic fallout of this pandemic could push 500 million people into poverty and take global progression back 3 decades and primarily in emerging economies. And so what's interesting, as I said earlier, that poverty has gone down so much in the last 30 years. So this will be the first time in that 30 years where global poverty is expected to significantly increase again. The attainment or the progress towards so many of our social or sustainable development goals is being threatened and pushed back right now. You know, we know too that in higher income countries, the stimulus packages that are being provided are pretty unlikely to reach those people that are already excluded from the economic mainstream. Another interesting and maybe potentially terrifying thought is that in May, the International Labour Organization, so pretty early on in some of this, the International Labour Organization warned that the steep decline in the ability to work and operate due to the pandemic is threatening the livelihoods of 1.6 billion workers in the informal economy, which makes up almost half of the global workforce. And so at this time, you know, it's been amazing before the pandemic, but in the last couple of years, it's been quite remarkable for me in terms of the number of books and articles and magazines and podcasts that are focusing on this idea of the transition of the economy, the transition of capitalism and, you know, the new capitalism or reinventing capitalism. And there's a woman by the name of Dr. Elizabeth Henderson who has recently written a book called Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. And some of the things that I've talked about today came from another TED Talk that was looking at the potential for evolution of capitalism. And I think that we are potentially seeing that. And I think right now when we have this, again, when we think about the new normal, whatever that means, for me, I really hope that that means that we're going to have an opportunity to rebuild in a new and better way. I think that we have a new appetite for a conversation about systemic change, about understanding those really underlying deep-rooted challenges and really figuring out why those are there and why is there resistance to some of these changes. I think the pandemic has really highlighted so many of the fragilities in our system. And as we think about what needs to happen and where we need to change and what we need to do differently, I think that as we come back from this needs to be a really important piece to consider. I think that it's such an interesting time, right? We have things that are so shut down and so many things that are changing and so many things that within our workforce didn't seem like they would be possible before. It didn't seem like they could possibly work. And here we are now in a whole different place where, yeah, working remotely is not only possible, it's totally necessary. In terms of having to be flexible and having to understand and deal with, different childcare and different elements like that, I think is such an important thing and such a remarkable thing that's happening right now. And so that does actually bring me to the end largely of what I had. I was really trying to make sure that I didn't talk for an entire week straight, that I maybe went a little bit on the light side of things, but I really was, as I said at the beginning, hoping to spur a conversation and see what sort of reflections or questions or thoughts or who agrees, who disagrees. I'd love to have a conversation about that.
If we have any questions, please either raise your hand or type it in the chat or just unmute your mic and please ask Roz the question.
Oh, I'm just looking in the chat. I see that people could hear the piano. That's awesome. I don't know why I couldn't hear it, but I'm glad to hear that you could. That's neat.
Oh, we got our first question. So what would you say are the first steps in developing a social enterprise?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, why don't I just stop sharing my PowerPoint for a moment. I'll pop it back up at the end with our finale slide. Just a little bit easier to see people this way, I think. So first steps in developing a social enterprise. I think for me the biggest thing is to really understand what is the problem that you are trying to solve. Like any entrepreneurial venture, really, I think really understanding that problem. The other thing, so by understanding the problem, I mean really trying to make sure that you are talking to the people who are experiencing it. This means, trying to gain lived experience or finding people who have that lived experience. I think one of the most worrisome, troublesome, challenging, or difficult ways to start is by saying, hey, I'm going to solve a problem for those people over there. As soon as it becomes anything about those people, it's never good. So from there, I think it's about having really understanding and identifying with that problem. And so the other thing that goes along with trying to understand that problem is really trying to understand who else is trying to solve that problem. Because if this is a social enterprise or a social problem that needs to be solved, I guarantee you someone, somewhere, maybe many someones are trying to solve this problem already. And so sometimes the question is not necessarily, the next step is not necessarily that we should start a social enterprise. A lot of times it might be that there is great work that is being done in the world, and the best thing that you could possibly do is support that work. One of the things that I think students find a little bit surprising when they come to my social enterprise class, it is an entrepreneurship class specifically talking about social enterprise, but I specifically don't make students create a social enterprise, because I don't think that becoming a social enterprise founder is the only way that we get to really engage with social enterprise. There's so many organizations out there that are doing great things. So that would be the first thing, is understand the problem, understand who else is out there and what is it that they are doing. And then trying to understand what the gaps are that exist between those two things, I think are a really important thing. From there, you can kind of decide where to go and how to tackle this problem. The other thing that I really encourage students or anyone considering this to do is to try to understand that system. I talked about it very briefly in that, but there's a couple of really interesting systems models that you can look at and try to dive deep into the understanding of something. And maybe I'll just actually pull up one other slide here if I can find it, because I think it is quite relevant. And so it's the idea of really trying to make sure that you are understanding the underlying reasons for why something is happening. And it's a great way of working to solve the root cause, not the symptom of it. And so there's a couple of different models of this. This is a way of thinking through systems, is to think about this iceberg model. And so an iceberg being, the things that we can see and the things that are so obvious to us about this problem tend to be a very small and potentially symptomatic element of why this problem is happening. And so if you can ask yourself not just what happened, but try to understand the patterns, the underlying trends, and the mental models that get us there. Because if you can attack the mental models that are holding some of these systems and some of these problems in place, the events and the systems that come from them tend to take care of themselves. The last thing that I think I would say, without taking up far too much time on this one, the last thing that I would say for starting a new social enterprise is really trying to figure out a way that you can have what you do be how you do it. And what I mean by that is that I see a lot of social enterprises that are, they kind of have to do two things, right? So there is an example of an organization that sells chocolate bars in order to fund eye care in rural India. There's examples of people who are selling hoodies in order to paint basketball courts in order to reduce crime in low-income neighborhoods. And while I find that those are wonderful and altruistic and fabulous things to have happen, in order to be good at both of those things, you have to be good at both hoodies and painting basketball courts. You have to be good at chocolate and eye care. You have to be good at kind of two different things. And as your company grows, which hopefully it will in order to scale and grow your impact, as those things grow, I'm just gonna stop sharing this again. As those things grow, you might find that there's some tension between those things. Well, it turns out that people love our chocolate bars and we're really, really good at that. And this, subsidizing the basketball court thing is just a bit too expensive. And so I think that they're good businesses. I don't want to take anything away from them. My concern is that at some point in the future, there will be some tension there. And so finding an organization that where their social good is the business that they are in, I think is really fascinating. And so there's great examples of organizations that takes, someone with disabilities and discovers that those disabilities are actually excellent. Those are give them an advantage in a certain market. And so there's an organization in Calgary, I believe they're called Meticulon now, that hires people with autism in order to code for them, in order to do web development and coding. Because people with autism, while in some places that might be a barrier to other elements of employment, they take those things and actually make them a benefit for what it is that they are doing, and it helps them to really be better at that. And so I think that those would be really the things, is trying to figure out a way that you don't have to do two different things, and what you do can be how you do it. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. So it kind of segues into another question we just received that was, how do you measure performance of a social enterprise if you cannot prioritize profit? So you've touched on it, but maybe elaborate a little more.
Absolutely. So that's a great question. And this is a really big one. I think it's a really emerging area of social enterprise. There's a lot of work that is being done to try to measure impact. Because yes, if you're not prioritizing profit and making more profit isn't your metric of whether you're doing it or not, how do you know? I think the wonderful thing about profit and about money is that it's so comparable, right? We have all of these different ratios and all of these different numbers that we can look at financially to look at different corporations to say that there is one is doing better, or one is a better investment, or one is, creating more opportunity than others. When we start to think about impact, that's a lot more difficult. It's a lot harder, absolutely. Because how do we decide whether the organization that is supporting, women out of domestic abuse and the organization that is planting trees in heavily deforested areas, which one of those is better? And so measuring the impact of those comes down to trying to create some standards around that. And so when I said at the beginning that I think there is a benefit to having some definitions and some standards, that's one of the reasons that I say that, because then we can kind of create some of these standards to measure against. So there's a number of different ways that you can go about it. Unfortunately, there isn't any one single method that everyone has adopted to make it super comparable just yet. But there is, I think, the B Corp impact assessment is one of them, right? When you become a B Corp, you are required to recertify every 3 years, which means that you're taking that impact assessment again every 3 years. And so that means that you can see how your score is improving across those different categories: the workers, the environment, the governance, and the community. And if you're getting better across those, then you can measure your performance in that way. There is a method called social return on investment. There is a Calgary organization called Simpact that is one of the leaders in developing and working through social return on investment calculations. This is a fairly in-depth calculation, and it's a process where you have someone who is basically an expert in this space to come in and work through the social return on investment. And so it's looking at trying to place a financial value on those things that don't tend to have financial value. And so some examples are looking at, so the YWCA has a social return on investment of $5 for every $1 that's invested or granted into this organization. And the way that was discovered was to say that, so if we can support a woman and often her children out of a domestic abuse sort of situation, if we can help her to find steady employment, we can find her somewhere to live, somewhere that she can and her kids can be safe, we can support her with childcare, we can help her get herself back on her feet and protect her kids so she isn't forced back into that terrible situation. Well, those kind of all sound like costs. However, when she isn't calling the cops, when she doesn't need an ambulance, when her kids aren't in danger, when she is getting a job and paying her taxes and buying more groceries and buying things for her kids, all of those are benefits. And so by looking at all of those trickle-down effects of an organization like that, there is this, it turns out that there's actually, a $5 benefit for every $1 that is being spent into an organization like that. There's a number of other ones. It's really quite interesting. I'm finding that a number of organizations are creating their own tools and their own methods. Harvard Business Review posted or announced one, had one in their magazine a few years ago called the Impact Multiple of Money. Deloitte has created their own social impact measurement tool, they call it. Royal Bank has created one. So there's a whole bunch of people that are creating ways of being able to go through this. There's so many more that I can name right now. And where it feels a little bit chaotic right now and that there aren't standards, I am reminded time and time again that in order to get to the financial accounting principles that we have now, that took more than 70 years to get to financial accounting when we're talking about just dollars and cents. And so the world of impact measurement and social impact, I think is reasonably new, maybe 20, 30 years old. The idea of impact investing only came around in 2008. And so if it took us 70 years to figure out how to compare dollars to dollars, I think it's going to take us a long time, unfortunately, but I think it's going to take some time, and it needs to take some time to create those standards where we can have those impact measurement standards.
Wow, Ross, so much food for thought. Thank you. If we bring it to Alberta a little bit, we have a couple of questions in that area. So the first is, what are your favorite local social enterprises and the ones that inspire you?
Oh, there's so many. We have quite a few B Corps in Alberta, which is neat. We have, and I'm not going to be able to name them all off the top of my head, but Righteous Gelato is one. They have been named as a best for the world a number of times. I know they've gotten themselves into a little bit of hot water lately with their Black Lives Matter gaffe, I guess. But I think typically that is an interesting organization that is really trying to, take a business and create some social good in the world. I think it's really neat that it where I said before, making sure that what you do is how you do it. I think the other thing that is interesting about social enterprise is that we don't just have to be solving social issues in order to be creating social impact. So that's a great one. There's Unbelts. There's, even Trico Homes is a B Corp. There's a number of great examples locally. I think Common Good is another really excellent one. I love Common Good. They're a linens company, Common Good Linens, I should say. So they are a linens company, but the work that they do is to help transition people out of homelessness. And so they are specifically hiring people out of homelessness in order to help them to get a job. They provide 170 hours of training, I think, where normally that industry it's about 20. So they're providing massive amounts of training to people that are transitioning out of poverty and out of homelessness in order to help them to set up a bank account, in order to help them, set up their, just all of those basic things that you need in order to be able to have a job. What's interesting about them, when we talk about, how do we measure progress if we're not measuring money? For them, high turnover is a good thing. High turnover means that they have, brought a number of people out of homelessness and out of poverty, and they're trying to be a transitional work company. And so having people that get hired by them and then move on into their next job, into their next role, are moving into their own house and able to or pay their own rent is a metric of success for them. And so I think that's a really interesting one. And I see so many great examples from students trying to come up with really interesting ways of solving different challenges. A recent Haskayne grad is a woman by the name of Victoria Ross, and she started a company called AgroSystems. And so while it's a little bit more on the solving an environmental problem than a social problem, she has been passionate about the idea of trying to support local farmers. Her dad is a farmer, and she's trying to find a way to, she saw him working 2 or 3 jobs when she was a kid in order to put food on the table. And so she's trying to create a way to lessen the burden on farmers, but also reduce the environmental impact of cattle farms, and specifically looking at ways to reduce the waste from cows and turn that into a viable resource. So taking cow poop and making it into a high quality fertilizer to grow better food. And so that's sort of her end game. Right now she's working with a number of breweries, and so she collects spent grain, brewery waste essentially, and she's got a process by which she is now turning that into animal feed. And so she can provide feed, high quality feed that used to just be garbage and used to go to landfill or compost, is now becoming a high quality input. It's now a valuable resource for farmers, for cows, and so many more. But I assume maybe there's more questions. If there's not, I'll keep talking.
So staying with the theme of Alberta, what kinds of resources are available to, what business support is available for social enterprises in Alberta?
Oh, lots. So there's a lot of good things happening. I think that there are places that will specifically work with, that their mandate is specifically social enterprises. And then there are lots of examples of places where even just the, entrepreneurship support is good for that as well. So Innovate Calgary, just a stone's throw away from the university, does a lot of work in the world of social enterprise and social impact. They work with the Social Innovation Academy. They have students come in to be interns and work with local social enterprises. So that's a valuable one. So through Enactus, there is some support that way as well. Enactus, that's students working and supporting elements that way. ATB has a branch of their business that is specifically focused on social enterprise. Let me think, what else? There's a few big ones that I'm missing, I know for sure.
BDC as well.
Pardon me?
BDC.
BDC, that's right, that's a good one. So from that sort of development side of things, there's a couple of smaller consulting companies, I guess, that work in this space as well. And I know that there is more and more interest in this. There are desires to support the, so another organization would be Momentum and Thrive. They're doing a lot of this work. There is the Be Local network that has just merged with Thrive that is trying to create a community around this. I see Christina Roberts is on the call, and I'm sorry, Christina, I can't remember off the top of my head the organization that you're working for now, but looking at trying to support the legal side of social enterprises as well, and really trying to understand the legal options and the incorporation options for social enterprises as well, in order to be able to create some options there as well. In Canada, we have, in BC and New Brunswick, there are corporate structures you can incorporate as a community, a social enterprise, essentially. They have different names for them in both provinces, but there is a corporate structure for the organization in order to become a social enterprise and have different tax benefits and different options that come that way. And so I know that that's an area of interest for Christina in particular. As I say, I'm feeling a little bit, an answer I should have more for, but I'm just blanking a little bit.
That's okay. We can always answer questions if they send them by email. We'll dig out the answers for them.
That's right.
Okay, so we have quite a few questions still coming in. The next one is, how do you find the team to establish the initiative when there is no revenue?
Interesting. So I assume when you mean no revenue, you mean because this is a startup and there's no money coming in yet, or? So I'm going to answer the question that way, and if that's not the case, either jump in or type in the chat if I'm off base. But so when there's no revenue coming in, as in you're in the early startup phases and you don't have any revenue happening yet, this is, advice that I would give to any aspiring entrepreneur, not just a social entrepreneur. At that point, I think the goal really needs to be trying to find ways of supporting yourself. So any sort of startup, there is going to be a time between when you start incurring costs and when you start receiving revenue. And it's called the valley of death. And it's, you know, there's a reason for that, because there's a lot of, pardon me, organizations that get stuck in that place and unfortunately don't make it out of that. And so things to do when you are in those very early stages before you are making enough money to cover your costs is to, you know, potentially keep your other job, you know, make this an evenings and weekends thing, put this on the side of your desk. Might mean you don't get to move along quite as quickly as possible. And so you keep it on the side of your, on the side of your desk, and so that you're still making money that way. The other thing is that there is an incredible number of grants and pitch competitions and ways that you can generate money. I've known of a few students who have been very, very successful on the, you know, the pitch circuit, and the opportunity to go and receive money and be able to fund your operations until you are getting to a revenue generating stage. Fortunately, there's lots of support out there. And I do see that someone's typed into the chat about, you know, local investing, YYC. That's money that's specifically for social enterprises. There's the Calgary Social Value Fund that's happening. And a few other things like that that are money that can maybe help you a little bit. Those you might need to be a little bit further along for, but there's lots in the way of grants. And there's a remarkable number of people out there that are wanting to help support this movement. About, let's see, it must have been nearly 10 years ago now, I was really interested in supporting or developing a, you know, a co-working space specifically for social enterprises. And there was a whole bunch of interest at that point. And I think that at that point, there was more people that were wanting to support social enterprises than there were people that were actually social entrepreneurs. There's another opportunity coming through in the Investment Readiness Fund is a national fund that is trying to help small companies and give them money in order to be able to be ready to receive money. Because there's a lot of people out there that are interested in scaling, but maybe aren't quite ready to yet. And so the other thing that I was going to say though, is that with respect to the, you know, how do you find people to work on the team when you don't have money? So, you know, if it's a passion project for people, there's a lot of people who are willing to volunteer and to help for, you know, a while before money. They need to be paid for their work. If they have other jobs and they're working with you on the side of their desk until you are getting paid, that is, you know, great too. I think the startup culture of getting people that are so committed and so passionate and wanting to solve this problem with you, that will really help, you know, keep people motivated and keep people on board with you. The goal for a social enterprise, I think, is, in my mind, I tend towards thinking about the for-profit social enterprise less than I do the, you know, the enterprising nonprofit, as they're sometimes called. And so for me, a successful, scalable social enterprise will tend to have a business model associated with it, which means that at some point you are selling a product or service that is going to give you enough money to fund your operations and pay for you and your growing team to be able to work on solving this problem.
You segued right into our next question, which talks about how to, the considerations for deciding on your business model. Within that spectrum of being a not-for-profit to a for-profit social enterprise, and to have that desired impact, how do you decide, or how do you figure out what is best for your social enterprise model?
Fascinating. So I'm sure that there are legal considerations for this, for one, that I don't have insight into, but from a business model perspective, for me, I would be looking at, you know, trying to understand what the demand for your product or service is. And so if there is demand and there is a market that is willing to pay and willing to buy, and you can prove that there is demand for it in that way, then my preference, and I am biased, I will admit that, my preference would be to go towards a for-profit model. For me, the for-profit model means that there is a a demonstration that the market values it, that there is demand for it. And so that's one piece. The other piece is that, when you have a successful model, you are scalable in that way, right? The more you sell, the more you do, the more money you make, therefore the more you can do. That's simplified, but technically that is a goal. In order to be able to fund your own operations, I think that's really valuable. There's an interesting statistic that is something like 75% of charities, not nonprofits exclusively, but 75% of charities only have enough operating capital for the next 3 months. So in 3 months from now, if they didn't continue fundraising, they would be out of money. And so for me, that's another benefit to the for-profit model, is that your fundraising effort is selling the thing that you were doing. It means that you don't have to spend time seeking donations and fundraising and going through that work. That administrative work can be put towards, the operations of the company. All that being said, if there is if there isn't something that can be sold, if there isn't a product or service that you are selling in order to fund these operations, but there is a social benefit by being created through your operations, then it's quite likely that the nonprofit model might be a better bet. Your options in terms of accepting donations and being able to write tax receipts, of being able to receive more in the way of grants, federal grants and different grant funding. Other charities and nonprofits can donate to you and fund your operations in that way. So from the business model perspective, as far as profit or nonprofit goes, I think those are the big things. Is there money to be made through your operations, or is this something that needs to be grant funded?
Thank you. So often we talk about sustainability, and many people think about sustainability as more environmental. So the next question is kind of looking at that side. Is environmental, so is social enterprise really just focused on social items, or do environmental concerns kind of fit within that, or is that a different subset of environmental enterprise, for example?
Interesting. So that's a good question. I think that, when we start to think about social problems and solving social problems, they are always intricately linked, or environmental problems can be intricately linked with social problems, right? So the environmental aspect, climate change, floods, poor air quality, pollution, all of those sorts of things might be an environmental issue, but they have direct, distinct, and entirely interconnected impacts on social issues. And so I think that, when we talk about social enterprise, I do tend to think more along the lines of a social problem versus an environmental problem. But I think that for me, one of the things that I really think about, in addition to the definitions that I put up at the beginning, kind of my test for things is looking at the intentionality of something. Is a company very specifically intending to create impact? And for me, impact is social or environmental, absolutely. And so if an organization is setting out and their main purpose for existing is to create impact, environmental or social, then I would consider them on the social enterprise side of the spectrum. If they are, doing good things and happen to, hey, oops, we did something environmentally good, isn't that handy? That for me would be that they're neither a social enterprise nor an environmental enterprise. And so I don't know that, I'm not aware of, an organization being considered an environmental enterprise versus a social enterprise. I think one of the other things in that spectrum is looking at You know, you can think about, yeah, sustainability, absolutely. But sustainability at the same time, I think, incorporates social aspects as well. You can't be a truly sustainable organization if you treat your employees poorly. You can't be a truly sustainable organization if you aren't hiring, if you don't have inclusive hiring practices. You can't be a truly sustainable organization if your workers are barely surviving on the wage that you provide to them. So for me, I think there are different elements, or maybe slightly different different components of the same thing. I think an organization that is explicitly focused on solving an environmental problem, if they are impact driven and that is their purpose, I personally would still consider them a social enterprise.
Sorry, thanks for clarifying that. It kind of touches this next question, which is, since revenue is critical to carry out a required social impact, does the business model need to focus on revenue generating and validating the model in order to be successful?
Sorry, I missed the very first part of that. Could you say that again?
Okay. So since revenue is critical to carry out required social impact, does a business model need to focus on revenue generation and validation of the model in order to be successful?
I would say yes. I think that yes, absolutely. If you are going to create a for-profit social enterprise and you are going to have a revenue generating model in order to run your operations, then yes, absolutely, you have to have a viable business model. I think and I'm borrowing a little bit from an organization called Acumen, and Acumen does a whole bunch of work in supporting social entrepreneurs and specifically trying to help alleviate poverty. And they have 3 questions that they ask in terms of determining if something is a social enterprise. And the first being, does it prioritize impact? And then the second, and I'm fully in support of this, the very second is, are they employing smart business practices? Now, that doesn't mean that they have to be a business. It doesn't mean that they have to be a for-profit business, but it does mean that there has to be some sort of, financial sustainability, I would say. And so, yes, if you have a revenue generating element to your social enterprise, you have to prove that you have demand for that. You need to you do your customer discovery. You need to go through that same process that any other startup company would need to do in order to get there. So yes, revenue can certainly be an important metric of success for a social enterprise. It's not the only metric of success, but creating money, creating revenue, creating profit is absolutely allowed. I think that's one of the misconceptions that I hear sometimes, is that if you're a social enterprise, you can't make profit, or at some point you make too much profit and you've stopped becoming a social enterprise. And so for me, that's not the case. If you're making a whole bunch of money by creating social impact, that's kind of the ideal. That's the goal, right? That's taking our profit motive and the best part of capitalism and applying it to a social issue. I think it's what you do with that revenue after the fact that matters, and where it gets reinvested into, and what you do with it that matters. But absolutely, if you have revenue generating as part of your social enterprise, you have to prove that you can generate revenue. Otherwise, you can just, it'll just be a really potentially altruistic idea that doesn't actually create any impact.
Thank you. So I put the Acumen Academy link in the chat in case anyone wants to follow up on that reference that you made. So our next question is a more localized question. Are worker-owned cooperatives like the Allium restaurant in Calgary considered to be a social enterprise? And what would that be an example of the social problem that they're solving? Would that be an example of the social problem they're solving is how they are doing it, putting ownership in the hands of workers? So
interesting.
Yeah,
I would say that, I would typically, I think there's going to be a big level of overlap between a cooperative and a social enterprise. I think a lot of times when a cooperative model is used, it is in an attempt to solve a collective social issue. And so, yes, when you're, the social problem that you're trying to solve is creating a fair, equitable, meaningful work sort of situation, then yes, absolutely, by hiring people or having the people who work for you also own the company, or work for the company also own the company, I think that yes, that absolutely helps to create a more socially just, equitable kind of organization, which to me definitely falls in the realm of social enterprise. I wouldn't say that every single co-op is definitely a social enterprise. I think the initial intention behind co-ops was the opportunity to create a solution to a social problem. And so there's a couple of great examples in addition to Allium of other co-ops within Alberta that were specifically designed to solve a social problem. And so there is an example for one where a farming community was going to lose the access to the grain elevator within their community because the rail company was finding that it was too expensive to get to their grain elevator to collect their grain and take it to market. And so all of these farmers that relied on this grain elevator were going to be challenged about getting their grain to market if this didn't happen. And so that group of farmers in that community got together, started a co-op in order to purchase the grain elevator and the operations that went along with it so that they could keep it and they could still be available to them, and then they got to run it. There's a couple of other great examples as well on the Alberta, I think it's the ACCA, Alberta Co-ops Association page. There's some great examples there. The local investing YYC organization that I mentioned a few moments ago, they are a co-op. And so that is an investment co-op and, looking to support social enterprises, but in themselves are trying to not just support social enterprise and create social impact in that way, but because they are a co-op, it means that you are investing your money locally, which means that your money is being reinvested locally. And it also means that they have created opportunities for this investment to be, and I'm sorry, I can't remember if it's RRSP eligible or there's a tax benefit to those investments because it's into a co-op. And so there's not just social benefit because they're investing into social enterprises, but there's social benefit because they created their structure as a co-op. So short answer, yes, I think the intention behind a co-op is to create that really fair, equitable kind of organization that is solving a problem for the members that are a part of that organization.
Thank you. So here's a question about one of your slides. It was the one about women on boards. So the question is, first of all, they talk about, thank you for broaching the subject, but they're curious about percentage of board members that are female. Is the one on your slide for for-profit companies, or does it include not-for-profit boards as well?
That slide was just for-profit companies. I'm trying to find it again now. So this was a number from the Canadian Securities Administrators, and this was for-profit boards in particular. That's a great question though, because certainly the number might be a little bit different incorporating nonprofit boards as well, but this was specifically for-profit corporate boards. And I think a corporation of any size, if I remember correctly, but that number was specifically for corporate boards. And unfortunately, if my memory serves, Alberta is lagging a bit behind the national average. It wasn't so long ago that we only had 9% of board members were female or something. I think that's gone up since then, which is great. And there is an organization called, again, there's lots, there's an organization called the 51 that is working on, actually they're specifically looking at female investment, but there's a number of organizations that are looking at, you know, increasing the number of women on boards as well.
Thank you. So there's a question about legal structures. So there's a bit of a discussion happening actually in our chat, which is really nice to see that there's a little community building. But to put the question to you, is there an organization, or what is the organization that provides legal support or advice to incorporate as a social enterprise?
Okay, awesome. I think that I saw that Christina responded to that. And so work with an organization called Integral.org, currently developing a tool to provide legal guidance to social entrepreneurs in selecting a legal structure. We also generally provide legal support to nonprofits and charities in Alberta. Visit integralorg.ca. And Christina also put a link in there from, I referred to the tool that Thrive was working on. And so this is Thrive in Denton's, which I think Christina helped to create, and a legal structure decision tool. So it looks at all of the legal structures that are available to a organization within Alberta, and all of the pros and cons and considerations to try and help to decide what structure makes the most sense for the organization and the goals of your organization. Oh, I see Travis Inlow responded as well. Thanks, Travis. The local investing YYC, the co-op investment shares are RSP and TFSA eligible. There was a tax credit, but our friends in the UCP got rid of it, I do believe, for the local investment tax credit.
I love that you call them our friends. So actually for questions, are there any more coming up? We've kind of run through all of the ones that were already posted. Does anyone have any additional questions? We're almost at time anyway, so. You can always send any questions that may come up to us at social.entrepreneur@haskayne.ucalgary.ca, and then we'll forward them on to Roz, or if you Google Roz, you'll find her email as well. So that's really
right. Share my screen here again.
A last question. Do you have an issue with maintaining talent due to funding or any financial issues?
As a social enterprise, I assume?
Yes.
So as far as finding talent, no, the statistics prove exactly the opposite. There are more and more surveys and more statistics all the time that prove that employees want to be employees, workers, you know, people entering the workforce, but also people who are, you know, mid-stage in their career are more interested that, and I can't remember the exact number, I'm sorry, it was something like 85% though, of workers, sort of younger workers, 30s and younger, would be more willing to work for an organization that has purpose, that creates impact, you know, a social enterprise of sorts. They would choose working at the social enterprise over a pay raise. They would take a pay cut in order to work at a social enterprise. It's not to say that they would have to take a pay cut, but it just demonstrates that higher salaries are not the only thing that people are caring about and looking at. Something like 91% of MBA grads in Canada say that they would prefer to work for a social organization, an organization that has that kind of purpose. And I think that the idea of social and environmental problems and, you know, being so conscious of that and being so aware of that and recognizing that there is a business case for these. There is money to be made by solving these problems. And so you know, businesses are recognizing this, and people entering the workforce recognize this. I had an MBA class just this winter, it was the first social enterprise MBA class. It was jam-packed. And every single person in there said, you know, we are here because this is the kind of work that we want to do. This is the kind of work, you know, we want work that is also meaningful. And so as far as attracting talent goes, I think that working for a social enterprise or being a social enterprise, in fact, improves your chances of hiring people and broadens the interest that people have in working for you. There are some examples of social enterprises where being a social enterprise does add costs to your model. So if you think about the Common Good Linens example, is when they're providing 120 hours of training where someone else is only providing 20, where their metric of success is higher turnover, and turnover is expensive. There are some costs that are associated with that that could potentially be a challenge. So as far as, you know, funding those employees goes, it's possible that a social enterprise could have higher costs as a result of the social work that they are doing. However, there is also potentially a broader market and more people that are interested in other competitive advantages that you can attain by being a social enterprise that make up for those costs. I hope that answers it.
Well, thank you so much, Roz. I mean, so much information that's been so great to listen to. I've received so many private comments about how eloquent you are and how you've made this information digestible. So thank you for all of this knowledge sharing that you've done with us today. To our audience, thank you also for being here and asking so many insightful questions. Since this was recorded, we'll probably be posting this on our website. So if you have friends that ask you about social entrepreneurship, you can send this link to them. Also, we're still developing our programming at the Trico Foundation Social Entrepreneurship Center. So we would love to hear what you thought of the session today, but what else you want from us, how else we can help you, how we can connect you to social entrepreneurship or the thought process around this. So I've put the link in the chat, but there's also a QR code that you can see on the slide if that's easier for you. And I'll follow up with an email for those of you that have already left. And Roz, as a token of our appreciation, here's a small gift for you. I don't know if you can. Here you go. I should have planned that better and given it to you beforehand.
That would have been funny. Could have like reached off the screen and grabbed
exactly.
it.
That would have been smart. Next time.
Next time for sure.
I'll put that in the mail for you. And
that's too kind. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you inviting me to do this, and for everyone being here and the questions that came up. What a wonderful conversation, and yeah, it's stuff I love to talk about. So any further questions or conversation that people would like to have, I'd love to hear from you. So thanks so much, Alia.
Thank you also. And we put both my email and Roz's email in the chat so you have access to them as well. So please don't hesitate. We love to hear from all of you guys. And thank you again and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you.